The summer heat was hitting London hard that Tuesday afternoon. Crowds of people were everywhere, all trying to get the perfect photo at Buckingham Palace. Among them was a man in his mid-30s, wearing a bright Hawaiian shirt and carrying a camera that looked more expensive than most people's cars. This tourist had been planning this trip for months. He worked long hours at his office job back home in America, and this vacation was supposed to be his big break from all the stress. But even here, thousands of miles away from his desk, he couldn't stop checking his phone every few minutes. Work emails kept coming in, and he felt like he was always behind on something. His teenage daughter was with him, rolling her eyes every time he stopped to take another selfie. She had her own phone out, but she was more interested in texting her friends back home than looking at the famous palace. The whole trip had been like this. Him trying to see everything and capture every moment while she just wanted to sit somewhere with good Wi-Fi. The man had already visited 3 other landmarks that morning. Tower Bridge, Big Ben, and Westminster Abbey were all checked off his list. He had this whole schedule planned out with exactly 30 minutes for each stop. His daughter kept telling him to slow down and actually enjoy things, but he wanted to make sure they saw everything London had to offer. The palace grounds were packed with tourists from all over the world. People were speaking dozens of different languages, all trying to get close to the famous Red Guards. Some visitors were being respectful, taking photos from a distance and reading the information signs. Others were pushing and shoving, trying to get the best angle for their social media posts. The American tourist looked at his watch and realized they were running behind schedule. They were supposed to be at the London Eye in an hour, and traffic looked terrible. He started feeling that familiar pressure in his chest that he got when things weren't going according to plan. This was supposed to be relaxing, but somehow it felt just as stressful as being at work. His daughter noticed her father getting anxious again. She had seen this look many times before, usually right before he started making decisions that embarrassed her. She tried to suggest they just take a few normal photos and move on, but he wasn't really listening anymore. The man started looking around for the best photo opportunity. He had seen other tourists getting really close to the guards, and some of them had gotten amazing reactions for their videos. His social media followers back home were expecting something special from this trip. He had been posting updates all week, and each post needed to be better than the last. There was something about being on vacation that made him feel like normal rules didn't apply. Back home, he would never dream of bothering someone at their job. But here, surrounded by other tourists doing crazy things for photos, it felt different. Everyone else was doing it, so why shouldn't he? The crowds were getting thicker as more tour buses arrived. People were starting to push more aggressively to get their shots. The man felt like he was running out of time and opportunities. His daughter was getting more uncomfortable by the minute, especially as she watched her father's behavior change. She had always been proud of her dad back home. He worked hard and took care of their family. But something about being a tourist brought out a different side of him. He became pushy and demanding, like the world owed him the perfect vacation experience just because he had paid for it. The heat was making everyone more irritable. Kids were crying, adults were snapping at each other, and the guards just stood there like statues dealing with all of it. The man wiped sweat from his forehead and decided he needed to do something that would make this whole trip worth it. He spotted one guard who was standing slightly apart from the others. This guard looked young and serious, with perfect posture and a spotless uniform. The man thought this would be perfect for the kind of video that would really impress his friends back home. He started walking toward the guard, his camera already recording. His daughter called after him, but he was too focused on getting his shot to pay attention. She had a bad feeling about what was about to happen, but she didn't know how to stop it without causing even more of a scene. The crowd around them started to notice too, sensing that something interesting was about to unfold. The stage was set for a moment that would change everything. The royal guard stood perfectly still, like he had been doing this his whole life. His red uniform was spotless, every button shining in the afternoon sun. His tall black hat sat perfectly straight on his head, and his rifle was held at exactly the right angle. To most tourists, he looked like part of the scenery, almost like a statue that happened to be breathing. But this guard was much more than a tourist attraction. His name was James, and he had been serving his country for over 6 years. Before standing at this palace, he had been in some of the most dangerous places in the world. He had seen things that most people only see in movies, and he had lost friends who would never come home. The job of being a royal guard wasn't easy. People thought all they did was stand around and look pretty for photos. But James knew better. This uniform meant something. It represented hundreds of years of service and sacrifice. Every day he put it on with pride, knowing he was part of something bigger than himself. James had learned to ignore almost everything the tourists did. They would make faces at him, try to make him laugh, and sometimes even touch his uniform. He had been trained to stay focused no matter what happened around him. His job was to protect this place and honor the traditions that came with it. The American tourist was getting closer now, his phone held high in the air. James could see him in his peripheral vision, but he kept his eyes focused straight ahead. He had dealt with hundreds of tourists like this one. Most of them just wanted a quick photo and then moved on to the next attraction. Other tourists started to notice what was happening. A small crowd began to form around James and the approaching American. Some people had their phones out, ready to record whatever was about to happen. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing that something wasn't quite right about the situation. The man's daughter was trailing behind him, looking more embarrassed by the second. She could see the way other people were staring at her father, and she didn't like it. She had tried to talk to him about being respectful when they visited other countries, but he seemed to think that paying for a vacation gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. James noticed the girl's discomfort. Even though he couldn't move his head to look at her directly, he could see her in his peripheral vision. She reminded him of his own younger sister back home. He felt a pang of sympathy for her, knowing she was about to be embarrassed by her father's behavior. The crowd was getting larger now. People from tour groups were pointing and whispering to each other. Some visitors from other countries were shaking their heads, clearly disapproving of what they were seeing. A few British tourists looked particularly upset, understanding better than anyone what the guard's uniform represented. Security guards were positioned around the area, but they were keeping their distance for now. They had procedures for dealing with disruptive tourists, but they usually tried to let things play out naturally first. Most situations resolved themselves without any need for intervention. The American tourist was now just a few feet away from James. He had his phone camera focused on the guard's face, trying to get the perfect angle. He was completely oblivious to the crowd that had gathered around him, focused only on getting the shot that would make his social media followers jealous. James could feel the man's presence getting closer. His training had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him, even when he couldn't react to it. He knew exactly where the tourist was standing, how close he was getting, and what he was probably planning to do. The girl made one last attempt to stop her father. She grabbed his arm and whispered something in his ear, but he shook her off without really listening. She stepped back, her face red with embarrassment, and covered her eyes with her hands. She couldn't bear to watch what was about to happen. Other tourists were starting to take sides. Some thought the whole thing was funny and were encouraging the American to do something outrageous. Others were clearly uncomfortable and were trying to move their own children away from the scene. A few older visitors were shaking their heads in disgust. James remained perfectly still through all of this. His breathing was steady, his posture was perfect, and his expression never changed. But inside, he was preparing himself for whatever was about to happen. He had dealt with difficult situations before, both here at the palace and in much more dangerous places overseas. The moment was building to something bigger than anyone in the crowd could have imagined. What happened next made everyone in the crowd uncomfortable. The American tourist stepped right up to James, completely ignoring the rope barriers that were meant to keep people at a safe distance. He held his phone just inches from the guard's face and started recording a video. "Come on, buddy," the man said loudly, waving his free hand in front of James's eyes. "Just give me a little smile for the camera. I know you want to laugh." James didn't move a muscle. His eyes stayed focused straight ahead, just like he had been trained to do. But the tourist wasn't giving up that easily. He started making funny faces, sticking his tongue out and crossing his eyes, trying to get some kind of reaction. The crowd was getting bigger now, and people were starting to murmur among themselves. Some tourists thought it was entertaining and were laughing along with the American, but others looked genuinely upset by what they were seeing. A few parents were pulling their children away, not wanting them to witness this kind of behavior. The man's daughter was mortified. She tried one more time to get her father's attention, tugging on his shirt and whispering for him to stop. But he was completely caught up in trying to create viral content for his social media accounts. He pushed her hand away without even looking at her. "This guy's like a robot," the tourist announced to the crowd still recording. "I bet nothing can make him move. Watch this." He reached out and actually touched James's rifle, running his finger along the barrel like he was inspecting it. Several people in the crowd gasped. Even tourists who didn't know much about military protocol could tell that touching a soldier's weapon was crossing a serious line. Some British visitors started speaking up, telling the American to stop, but he either didn't hear them or didn't care. James felt every touch, every gesture, every disrespectful comment. His military training had taught him to endure much worse than this, but it didn't make it any less insulting. This uniform wasn't a costume for tourists to play with. It represented years of service, sacrifice, and the memory of friends who had died protecting their country. The tourist was getting bolder now. He put his hand on James's shoulder and started talking directly to his phone camera. "Look at this guy. He's like a toy soldier that someone wound up and forgot to turn off. I wonder if he's even real." The crowd was starting to turn against the American now. People were shaking their heads and making disapproving comments. A few tourists were recording the scene, but not because they thought it was funny. They were documenting what they saw as completely inappropriate behavior. Security guards were moving closer now, but they hadn't intervened yet. They had procedures to follow, and they wanted to give the situation a chance to resolve itself naturally, but they were ready to step in if things got any worse. The man continued his performance for the camera, making jokes about toy soldiers and dress-up games. He seemed to think he was being clever and entertaining, completely oblivious to how his behavior was affecting everyone around him. His daughter had given up trying to stop him and was standing off to the side, tears in her eyes. "I mean, seriously," the tourist said to his phone. "What kind of job is this? Standing around all day in a funny costume, pretending to be important. I could do this job with my eyes closed." Those words hit James harder than any of the physical gestures had. This wasn't just some tourist being annoying anymore. This was someone mocking everything that James and his fellow soldiers had dedicated their lives to. The uniform he wore represented sacrifice, honor, and service to something greater than oneself. James thought about his friends who had worn similar uniforms in much more dangerous places. He thought about the ones who hadn't made it home. He thought about what they would say if they could see this tourist treating their service like a joke for social media entertainment. The crowd was getting restless now. Some people were calling for security to intervene. Others were trying to talk to the American directly, asking him to show some respect. But he was too caught up in his performance to listen to anyone. The man made one final gesture that pushed things too far. He reached up and tried to adjust James's hat, treating him like a mannequin in a store window. The crowd collectively held its breath, waiting to see how the guard would respond to this ultimate act of disrespect. But what happened next was something nobody could have predicted. Instead of breaking his composure or calling for backup, James did something that would change everyone's understanding of what they were witnessing. The entire crowd went silent as James did something completely unexpected. Instead of shouting or pushing the tourist away, he slowly and carefully reached into his uniform jacket. His movements were deliberate and controlled, never breaking his perfect military posture. Everyone watched in complete silence. The American tourist stopped his commentary and stepped back slightly, suddenly unsure of what was happening. His phone was still recording, but now he seemed nervous rather than confident. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something important was about to unfold. James's hand emerged from his jacket holding something small. It was a photograph, slightly worn around the edges from being carried for so long. He held it steady in front of him, just high enough for people nearby to see. His eyes, which had remained fixed straight ahead throughout the entire encounter, briefly glanced down at the image. The tourist leaned forward, trying to see what the guard was showing him. His cocky attitude was quickly fading, replaced by confusion and growing concern. The crowd around them was completely quiet now, everyone straining to understand what they were witnessing. The photograph showed two young soldiers in military fatigues, standing in what looked like a desert location. Both men were smiling broadly, their arms around each other's shoulders in the way that close friends do. They looked happy and proud, despite being in what was obviously a very dangerous place. One of the soldiers in the photo was clearly James, though he looked younger, and was wearing different camouflage instead of his red ceremonial uniform. The other soldier had his right leg missing below the knee and was balancing on crutches, but his smile was even brighter than James's. Despite his injury, he was holding a small British flag in his free hand. The American tourist stared at the photograph, his mouth slightly open. Slowly, the reality of what he was seeing began to sink in. This wasn't just some guy in a costume standing around for tourists to mock. This was a real soldier who had served his country in real wars, alongside friends who had paid real prices for their service. The crowd could sense the shift in mood, even those who couldn't see the photograph clearly. People stopped talking and moving around. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. Even tourists who had been laughing along with the American just minutes before were now standing in respectful silence. James held the photograph steady for almost a full minute, never saying a word. His face remained expressionless, but the message was clear to everyone watching. This uniform, this tradition, this ceremony that the tourist had been mocking, it all meant something much deeper than entertainment for visitors. The tourist's daughter, who had been standing off to the side in embarrassment, slowly walked closer to see what had caused such a dramatic change in the atmosphere. When she saw the photograph, her eyes filled with tears. She understood immediately what her father had been too ignorant to realize. Other people in the crowd were starting to understand, too. Veterans who were visiting with their families recognized the significance of what they were seeing. Parents began explaining quietly to their children why everyone had become so serious all of a sudden. The American tourist looked up from the photograph to James's face, then back down to the image again. His hands were shaking slightly as he finally turned off his phone camera. The video he had been so excited to share on social media suddenly felt like something he wanted to delete forever. James carefully returned the photograph to his jacket pocket, his movement still slow and deliberate. He never broke his military bearing, never spoke a word, never showed any emotion on his face. But his message had been delivered more powerfully than any speech could have accomplished. The tourist stepped backward, his face flushed with shame and embarrassment. He looked around at the crowd, seeing for the first time how his behavior had affected everyone present. People were staring at him, but not with the admiration he had expected. They were looking at him with disappointment and disgust. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. No one seemed to know what to do or say next. The American tourist looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. His daughter was crying openly now, not from embarrassment, but from a mixture of shame and newfound respect. Security guards were still nearby, but they made no move to intervene. They could see that something profound was happening, something that couldn't be resolved with enforcement or removal. This was a moment of education and understanding that needed to play out naturally. The crowd remained frozen in that moment of realization, everyone processing what they had just witnessed in their own way. The photograph told a story that no words could express. As more people in the crowd got a closer look, the full weight of James's message became clear. The two soldiers in the desert weren't just posing for a casual photo. They were brothers in arms who had been through hell together and somehow found reasons to smile. The injured soldier in the picture was named David, though the crowd didn't know his name. What they could see was his incredible spirit. Despite losing his leg in an explosion that had nearly killed him, he was grinning from ear to ear in that photograph. His crutches didn't look like a burden. They looked like tools that helped him stand tall with pride. James had taken that photo just 3 days before David was killed. They had been clearing a road of explosive devices when another bomb went off. David had pushed 3 local children out of the way, saving their lives but losing his own in the process. The flag he was holding in the photograph was the same one that had been draped over his coffin when he came home. The American tourist was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He had been mocking someone who had watched his best friend die for strangers in a foreign country. He had been treating like entertainment a man who carried the memory of fallen heroes everywhere he went. The crowd was learning too. People who had been laughing just minutes before were now standing in complete silence. Some visitors were wiping tears from their eyes. Parents were having quiet conversations with their children about respect and sacrifice. James continued to stand at perfect attention, but everyone could see that showing the photograph had cost him something. His breathing was slightly deeper now, and there was a subtle tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. Sharing that memory, even without words, had opened an old wound that never fully healed. The tourist's daughter understood better than anyone what was happening. She had studied military history in school and knew about the wars that soldiers like James had fought in. She could see the pain in the guard's eyes even though his expression remained neutral. She felt ashamed of her father's behavior and proud of the guard's dignity at the same time. Other tourists were starting to back away, giving James more space and showing the respect they should have shown from the beginning. The atmosphere around the palace entrance had completely changed. What had been a circus of photo opportunities just minutes before was now a solemn reminder of the real world beyond the tourist attractions. The American realized that every joke he had made, every disrespectful gesture, every mocking comment had been an insult not just to James but to every soldier who had ever worn a uniform. He was starting to understand that the guard's job wasn't to entertain tourists, it was to honor the memory of people like David who had given everything for their country. James slowly and carefully tucked the photograph back into his jacket pocket, right over his heart. He had carried it with him every day since David's funeral, through multiple deployments and now through his service as a royal guard. It reminded him why the uniform mattered, why the traditions were important, and why he couldn't let tourists treat his service like a game. The crowd could see that this wasn't just any photograph. This was a sacred memory, a connection to someone who was gone forever. James had chosen to share his most precious possession with a stranger who had been treating him terribly, hoping to teach a lesson about respect and understanding. Several veterans in the crowd recognized what they were seeing. Some of them had their own photographs tucked away in wallets and pockets, pictures of friends who hadn't made it home. They understood the weight of what James had just shared, and they began to stand straighter themselves, forming an unofficial honor guard around the scene. The tourist looked down at his expensive camera and designer clothes, then back up at James in his immaculate uniform. For the first time, he saw the guard as a real person rather than a tourist attraction. He saw someone who had experienced loss and trauma that he couldn't even imagine, someone who continued to serve despite carrying that burden every day. The revelation was spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. People were quietly explaining to each other what they had witnessed. Tour guides were having serious conversations with their groups about the difference between entertainment and respect. Children were asking their parents important questions about war and sacrifice. The moment stretched on, with James maintaining his perfect posture, while everyone around him processed the lesson he had just taught without saying a single word. The change in the American tourist was immediate and overwhelming. His face went from confusion to understanding to deep shame in a matter of seconds. The photograph had hit him like a physical blow, knocking all the arrogance and entitlement right out of him. He looked down at his phone, still in his hand, and realized he had been recording the entire encounter. The video that was supposed to be funny content for his social media now felt like evidence of his own terrible behavior. Without hesitation, he deleted the recording right there in front of everyone. His hands were shaking as he slowly removed his baseball cap. Back home, he might have thought this gesture was unnecessary or old-fashioned, but standing there in front of James with the memory of David between them, it felt like the most important thing he had ever done. He held his hat against his chest and stood as straight as he could manage. The tourist's daughter watched her father's transformation with amazement. She had never seen him like this before. Usually when he made mistakes, he tried to justify them or blame someone else. But this time was different. This time he seemed to truly understand the weight of what he had done. For several long minutes, the American stood in complete silence. He didn't try to make excuses or explain his behavior. He didn't attempt to lighten the mood with jokes or small talk. He simply stood there, accepting the full impact of the lesson he had just received. Other tourists in the crowd were watching this transformation with fascination. Many of them had been guilty of similar behavior at other times and places. They saw themselves in the American shame and began to reconsider their own attitudes toward the people and traditions they encountered while traveling. The man found himself thinking about his own life in ways he never had before. He thought about his comfortable office job, his suburban home, his complaints about minor inconveniences. He compared all of that to what James and David must have experienced in the desert, facing real danger every day to protect people they would never meet. James continued to stand at attention, but he could sense the change in the tourist's demeanor. The mocking and disrespect had been replaced by something much more appropriate, genuine remorse and growing respect. This was what James had hoped for when he decided to share David's photograph. The American realized that his vacation behavior had been a reflection of a deeper problem in his life. He had become so focused on getting what he wanted that he had forgotten to consider how his actions affected other people. The guard's quiet dignity had shown him a different way to be in the world. Tears began to form in the tourist's eyes as the full weight of his actions sank in. He had mocked a man who had lost his best friend in service to others. He had treated sacred traditions like entertainment. He had embarrassed his daughter and himself in front of dozens of strangers. But more than just feeling bad about what he had done, the American was beginning to understand what he should have done instead. He should have approached with respect and curiosity. He should have tried to learn about the history and meaning behind the uniform. He should have set a better example for his daughter. The crowd around them remained silent, giving both men the space they needed to process this moment. Some people were crying quietly, moved by what they were witnessing. Others were having their own moments of reflection, thinking about times when they had shown disrespect or failed to recognize the sacrifices of others. The tourist's daughter slowly walked over to stand beside her father. She didn't say anything, but her presence offered support during what was clearly one of the most difficult moments of his life. She was proud of him for accepting responsibility and showing genuine remorse. Security guards who had been prepared to intervene were now standing back respectfully. They could see that justice was being served in a much more powerful way than any enforcement action could have accomplished. The guard had handled the situation with perfect professionalism and grace. The American stood there for what felt like an eternity, his hat pressed against his heart, his head slightly bowed in respect. He was learning what true strength looked like, not the loud, demanding behavior he had shown earlier, but the quiet dignity and self-control that James displayed every day. Other tourists began to follow his example. Caps and hats came off throughout the crowd. People stood straighter and spoke more quietly. The entire atmosphere around the palace entrance had been transformed by one soldier's decision to share his most precious memory with a stranger who needed to learn about respect. Word of what had happened began spreading through the crowd like wildfire. People who had missed the initial encounter were hearing about it from others, and more visitors kept arriving to see what was causing such an unusual atmosphere at the palace gates. Instead of the usual chaos of tourists trying to get the best photos, something remarkable was happening. People were maintaining a respectful distance from James, creating a natural circle of space around him. The pushing and shoving had stopped completely, replaced by quiet conversation and thoughtful observation. An elderly British man who had been watching from the beginning slowly began to clap. His applause was soft and measured, not the enthusiastic cheering you might hear at a show, but the respectful recognition of something meaningful. Others joined in, and soon the entire crowd was applauding, not for entertainment, but in genuine appreciation for both James's dignity and the American's transformation. Several people in the crowd were veterans themselves, visiting London with their families. They understood better than anyone what James's photograph represented. One by one, they stepped forward and offered silent salutes to the guard. Their wives and children watched with pride as these former soldiers honored their fellow servicemen. Parents throughout the crowd were having quiet but important conversations with their children. Kids who had been excited about seeing the funny hat soldiers were now learning about service, sacrifice, and respect. Many families would leave that day with a completely different understanding of what military service really means. The American tourist's wife, who had been shopping nearby, arrived to find her husband standing silently with his hat over his heart. When their daughter explained what had happened, she felt a mixture of embarrassment and pride. Embarrassed by her husband's initial behavior, but proud of how he had responded to being corrected. Tour guides who brought groups to the palace regularly had never seen anything like this. Usually, they had to constantly remind their tourists to be respectful and follow the rules. But now, people were policing themselves, shushing anyone who spoke too loudly and making sure everyone maintained appropriate distance from the guards. Some tourists began taking photos again, but these were different kinds of pictures. Instead of trying to get silly selfies with the guards, people were capturing the moment of respect and reflection that had developed. They wanted to remember this lesson and share it with others back home. Social media posts about the incident started appearing almost immediately, but they weren't mocking or making fun of anyone. Instead, People were sharing stories about the importance of respecting military service and learning from cultural differences while traveling. The Americans' deleted video had been replaced by dozens of respectful tributes. The crowd included people from many different countries and cultures, but they were all united in this moment of understanding. Language barriers didn't matter when it came to recognizing dignity and respect. People who couldn't speak to each other were still able to share in the experience of witnessing something profound. Security guards reported later that they had never seen such well-behaved crowds at the palace. Usually they spent their shifts managing disputes and enforcing boundaries. But for the rest of that afternoon, visitors seemed to naturally understand how to behave appropriately. James continued his duty throughout all of this, maintaining his perfect posture and professional demeanor. But those who looked closely could see a subtle change in his expression. The tension that had been building during the disrespectful encounter had been replaced by something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps hope. Local London residents who happened to be passing by stopped to see what was causing such an unusual scene. They were accustomed to the tourist chaos around the palace, but this quiet respect was something entirely different. Many of them stayed to witness what felt like an important moment in the relationship between visitors and their city. The media presence that was always around the palace began to take notice as well. Reporters who usually covered royal family news found themselves documenting something much more human. A story about learning, growth, and the power of quiet dignity to change hearts and minds. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd continued to grow, but the respectful atmosphere never changed. People were sharing the story with new arrivals, explaining what they had witnessed and why it mattered. The palace entrance had become an unexpected classroom where hundreds of people were learning about respect, service, and the importance of understanding before judging. The transformation that had begun with one tourist's realization was spreading throughout the entire area, creating ripple effects that would continue long after everyone went home. The American tourist and his family finally walked away from the palace that afternoon, but the man who left was completely different from the one who had arrived. His daughter noticed the change immediately. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and kept looking back at James with something that looked like gratitude. That evening, back in their London hotel room, the man sat down with his laptop and began writing. Instead of the light-hearted vacation blog post he had planned, he found himself crafting something much more serious. He wrote about his mistake, about what he had learned, and about the guard who had taught him one of the most important lessons of his life, without saying a single word. His post went viral within hours, but not in the way his original video would have. People shared it because it was honest, humble, and educational. Comments poured in from veterans, military families, and other travelers who had their own stories about learning to show proper respect while visiting foreign places. When the family returned home to America, the changes in the father continued to grow. He couldn't stop thinking about James and David, about the sacrifice that military service required, and about how many veterans in his own community he had never really noticed or appreciated before. Within a month of returning home, he had signed up to volunteer at a local veterans center. He started small, just helping with paperwork and organizing events. But as he met more veterans and heard their stories, his commitment grew stronger. He realized that supporting those who had served was something he wanted to do for the rest of his life. His daughter was amazed by her father's transformation. She had always loved him, but she had often been embarrassed by his behavior when they traveled. Now she saw someone who approached new experiences with curiosity and respect, instead of entitlement and demands for entertainment. The man also began making annual donations to military charities, specifically choosing organizations that supported soldiers who had been wounded in combat. Every time he made a donation, he thought about David's smile in that photograph and the fact that he had continued to serve even after losing his leg. Back in London, James continued his duties as a royal guard. He never knew about the blog post or the volunteer work, or the donations that had resulted from their encounter. But he did notice that tourists seemed to be treating him and his fellow guards with more respect than usual. Other guards heard the story of what James had done, and it spread throughout their ranks. Many of them carried their own photographs and memories, and they were inspired by how James had turned a difficult situation into a teaching moment. The incident became part of the informal training that experienced guards shared with newcomers. The tourist's wife later said that the day at Buckingham Palace had saved her marriage. She had been growing tired of her husband's selfish behavior and demanding attitude. Seeing him learn humility and develop genuine compassion for others reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. The man's transformation affected his work life too. He became known in his office as someone who listened more and talked less, who showed appreciation for his colleagues' efforts, and who volunteered for community service projects. His employees noticed that he treated them with more respect and seemed genuinely interested in their well-being. Years later, the family returned to London for another vacation. This time, their visit to Buckingham Palace was very different. They stood respectfully at a distance, observed quietly, and made sure their behavior set a good example for other tourists. The man never forgot the location where his life had been changed by a soldier's quiet dignity. James eventually finished his service as a royal guard and moved on to other responsibilities. But he kept David's photograph with him always, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons or force, but with patience, dignity, and the courage to share painful truths with strangers who need to learn. The ripple effects of that afternoon continued to spread in ways that neither man could have imagined. The tourist blog post was used in training programs for tour companies, teaching guides how to help their clients show appropriate respect at cultural sites. Military organizations shared the story as an example of how service members could honor their fallen comrades even in civilian settings. Most importantly, the story reminded countless people that behind every uniform, every tradition, and every ceremony, there are real human beings with real experiences, real losses, and real reasons for taking their duties seriously. It showed that learning respect doesn't always require punishment or enforcement. Sometimes it just requires one person brave enough to share their truth with someone who needs to hear it.